Good morning, everybody. I'll just give a little bit of background and context as to how we ended up in this space. So Birmingham City Council has identified a new corporate priority, moving from crisis to prevention. So that's from 2022, and it'll take us through to 2026. There's a bit of a backstory to this becoming a council priority, and you know, some of this won't be unfamiliar to many people on the calls. There are a number of initiatives across the city, both internal and external to the council, and there's a growing evidence base over a number of years which demonstrates that actually if you intervene early within people's lives, if you take a far more preventative approach, take a strength-based approach, you get far better outcomes for our citizens and communities. I think it's fair to also say that we you know, over 15 years of reductions to council budgets, we've also demonstrated the opposite. That if you keep your resources invested in the crisis space, if you raise the thresholds around statutory interventions, then it doesn't necessarily give you good outcomes. It doesn't necessarily balance the books either. So you can take a look at this from whichever space you choose to sit in. I think what's also fair to say is that individual services have been led by individual budgets, and you know, some areas a lot of transactional in terms of their nature, which, as we know, results in repeat presentations, either people coming to us too late, people not coming to us at all, and ultimately costly statutory interventions. As we started this journey within adult social care, and that's the space that I sit in, but I will be talking whole life, of course, throughout my presentation. We started a different journey back in 2017, started with a £53 million deficit within adult social care alone. It was, you know, sternly said to us that we're going to, you know, sink the council if we don't turn things around as a directorate. And therefore we had to take a very brave approach, which was, rather than, you know, trying to be simply far more efficient in the crisis space, which is important, we also took a brave step of shifting investment into prevention activity, shifting investment into communities, and also building alongside that a strength-based, locality-based social work model, which was closely linked to the assets within communities. What that enabled us to do was to hang on to a number of budgets that were over a period of years declining. Some of you may remember the old SP budgets. We were able to revamp those within the context of adult social care. But I guess what's, you know, and that, as I say, you know, those examples aren't unique to Birmingham. What is unique to us as a city council is that we now have the mandate to take the best practice and the learning from across the city, and we're on a journey to transform our council. So shifting from crisis to prevention becomes a corporate priority. We're at the start of that journey. We're in phase one. We've been working alongside our colleagues, EY, as our strategic partner on this journey. And we have a way to go, because we know that transformations of this nature take anything up to 4 to 5 years. But I'm here to share our learning so far, share our pain so far, and some of the good outcomes that we've achieved certainly over the first 12 months of the programme. I think we'll move on to the first slide, please. The second slide. Yeah, that'll do. Thank you very much. We'll start there. So one of the issues behind what I've just said there is that if we look at this from a citizen perspective and we look at this from an outcomes perspective, the arrangements that I've described within Birmingham City Council lead to a fragmented experience for citizens. So depending upon where you land in the council, you either get a good service or a not so good service, and you know, that's not acceptable for us as a local authority, and we essentially need to turn that around. We also need to stop looking at things in terms of fragmented boxes. Is it children's social care? Is it adult social care? Is it a housing issue? Is it an inclusive growth issue? Is it a communities issues? Rather than looking at the entire household and the family and thinking about services and outcomes over a life course, and outcomes that are rooted very much within communities. So we build a relational life as well, so that we don't inadvertently create a dependency upon good delivery from the local authority alone. Next slide, please. Now, as you would expect, our first heated conversation, shall I say, was what do we mean by early intervention and prevention? So when you've got a room full of people from different disciplines, public health, children's services, housing, adult social care, they look at early intervention and prevention from very, very different lenses. And I think it's fair to say that none of those are incorrect, but it can get in the way of moving things along in terms of agreeing the direction of travel and starting to implement some of the things that we like to implement. So what we did was we lifted that right back up and said, accepting all of the disciplines that have informed these definitions, we need something very high level that we can all agree upon. So, you know, early intervention is very much about identifying risk factors, but also those protective factors that halt the development of a problem or that is developing or already evident, preventing citizens from stepping up into higher tier of support. And then prevention is very much around, you know, delivering activities that either help or stop a social or psychological problem arising in the first place, i.e. supporting citizens to remain in that universal space. So as I say, a fairly high level definition. Next slide, please, Sylvie. So one of the first things that we had to do was we had to create our vision, as you would expect, in terms of how we would start to evolve a crisis to prevention approach from Birmingham City Council. And our vision has been designed, as you would expect, with our citizens and our stakeholders and our staff and a whole host of partner organisations, including the voluntary and community sector. But at its heart, it's very much around independence, enabling citizens to be economically and socially active and resilient citizens throughout their lives. And then the question was asked, well, what do you mean by that? What does it mean in practice? And there are a number of building blocks, if you like, which have to sit behind this vision to turn it into a reality. And one is making sure that at the heart of this, we keep that citizen-centric approach when we're developing those outcomes for our citizens, and making sure that we therefore build that independence and that resilience. We talk a lot about MDT teams, we talk a lot about integrated offers. What we want to do is we want to leverage the strengths in terms of all of those best practice and how we bring that together as a coherent offer. We often hear lots of stories about citizens getting lost in systems, being thrown back out of systems, and by the time they do get in front of somebody who's listening to them, it's too late and they're in crisis. And then having a really strong focus on data and insight. The council holds data across a whole host of directorate functions, etc. But how do we bring that data together to have a single view of the citizen so that we can make those choices on the ground as to who is best placed to make contact, be the first contact with individuals? How do we use our data and support our frontline staff in terms of how we target our resources more effectively, how we use predictive analytics to say, these are the individuals and the households we need to proactively engage with before they topple over. But then at the same time, making sure that we use data in a secure way. We also opt for digital first wherever possible, but recognising that even a city like Birmingham, we've got digital deserts for a whole host of reasons. Sometimes it's because of connectivity, sometimes it's because of affordability, and sometimes it's because of skills. And we also recognise that when you are taking an all-age approach, we will have cohorts of population that still want and need a face-to-face interaction, want and need to speak to somebody over the phone, and those options need to remain available, but we need to make the best use of them. And then throughout this, you know, it would be wrong for me to sit here and not talk about efficiency and effectiveness in terms of the way that we transform our services. But in terms of the value that we wanted to deliver, this is very much citizen focused in terms of how we create supportive networks for our citizens within the communities, on their doorsteps, close to where they live, how we enable them to feel more independent and resilient, and as well as having a positive experience of the City Council. And then for staff, it's about working differently, collaboratively, both internally and externally with partners. And I think it's fair to say that some of our staff have lost some of that interaction over the years. And again, that's through no fault of their own, but it's due to the pressures that the City Council has been under. And then enabling staff to feel far more engaged in their organisation, but also about job satisfaction as well. And those case studies are starting to come through already. And then obviously from a council point of view, it's how we reduce re-referrals, how we manage our statutory demand far more effectively. So it's appropriate. So we do avoid, reduce or delay wherever we can. And it's about those positive interactions with our citizens and partners. Next slide, please. This is just a bit of a backdrop to the city. As you can see, huge issues across the piece, from our unemployment rates. We are a relatively young city, but whereas if we look at the opportunities for children and young people, 40% of our children live in relative poverty. And if you look across to health and well-being in terms of infant mortality, significant high rates there, alongside issues around community resilience and cohesion, and high rates of homelessness as well. Next slide, please. So just thinking this through then, in terms of our engagement with our citizens and our stakeholders and our partner agencies, and also staff within the local authority, one of the things that we recognised very early on was what we wanted to do was build upon the best practice that we have in the city. Some of you may have heard of an organisation called St Basil's. They're an organisation that operate in Birmingham and in the West Mids, and they work with youth homelessness. And one of the things that they did, working with Central Homelessness around their engagement around the Homeless Reduction Act, and prior to that as well, was to create a prevention pathway. And what we did was we took the learning from that prevention pathway and asked the question, okay, how do we now elevate that from young people and apply that within the local authority and across the city as well? I'm hoping there isn't anything too unfamiliar here in terms of prevention pathway. It appears as through various guises in various policy documents. But what's really apparent here is that universal space. As council officers, it's very easy and instinctive to jump into that targeted interventions, and we're all great in a crisis. The pandemic has demonstrated how good we are in a crisis as local authority officers, but it's that universal space that often gets neglected. And really what we wanted to do as part of the creation of an early intervention and prevention culture within the city and within the local authority is to spend a bit more effort to say, what are the agencies that operate in that space and how can we maximise their potential and their impact from an early intervention and prevention point of view. And I'm going to talk about the library experience shortly and how we're evolving that through. But this is very much about where citizens can. They are able to navigate solutions very, very easily, or they're supported to do so. either whether that's a friend, a family member, community organisation, or a member of staff. And then you work that through all the way through triage, recognising that some people will need targeted support, but we're able to work collaboratively, we're able to get in much earlier, and we're able to use our resources far more effectively. I talked about data. This is very much around how we use a single view around our citizens to work out who's best placed to work with individuals, but also about how we coordinate and line up the interventions in an appropriate way. But we recognise also that crisis interventions and relief, people will always fall into crisis, but what we want to do is minimise the numbers that avoidably, don't need to be in that space. But also recognising that if we take a strength-based approach, this is very much about recovery too, and how we build strengths with individuals, households and communities to avoid that further escalations or future escalations or incidences of crisis. But ultimately what we've got sitting underneath this is how do we use our data to predict and prevent and intervene far more earlier than we do already. Next slide, please. So currently 3 areas in terms of the programme. One is determining what services and capabilities will be core to an early intervention and prevention function in the future across the council. Should it be a service or a directorate? We are fast reaching the decision this needs to be a directorate, but however, it cannot be a siloed directorate. It's a whole council approach, so there needs to be an absolute culture shift. So there will be services that influence and support a particular directorate or function, and we need to make sure that everybody is operating in a way which supports an early intervention and prevention culture across the City Council. We've got some accelerators as well, and given the current cost of living crisis, it will come as no surprise to you that homes and money is a key focus for us. So again, in that space, how do we offer holistic guidance and support to people that are financially vulnerable, and empowering them to achieve, better financial resilience, maintain their housing, safe and secure housing as part of that. And that includes in-work poverty as well, in terms of how we support people through skills, training, etc., to get a better job, a higher paid job, as part of their direction of travel. And then obviously we are looking at the libraries as another accelerator area, and this is again as to how we look at the library experience or the library space as a means by which we can engage people much more early, as well as supporting lifelong learning, enabling networks to flourish and enabling citizens to thrive within communities. Libraries are a safe and trusted space, and our feedback from some of our citizen and staff engagement is people see libraries as a backdoor and as an early door into council services. So how do we take that as a safe, trusted space and move that forward? And then, as I say, there's a read across to the cost of living process. Every local authority is developing processes around how do we respond to the cost of living crisis. So warm hubs, warm spaces, places of welcome, propping up all over the country. This is access to individuals that are vulnerable. So thinking ahead in terms of how we, rather than bombarding people with literature and information, how do we use that space to do soft introductions around what other support services are available, and how do we take the learning from this crisis in terms of how we develop an early intervention and prevention culture moving forward. So it's about aligning the two together. Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide, please. So this diagram has been co-designed with our citizens and stakeholders, and what it does is it presents a citizen's view of what a homes and money hub could look like. And what we want to do is start with what's strong and not what's wrong in terms of enabling people to help themselves, It's about being proactive. So if we think about back to the vision, it's about being proactive and targeting individuals. So if we take a human-centric approach to say, let's say text messaging or WhatsApp messaging, when somebody ends up in arrears, you know, the typical thing to do is send a letter to say, oh, you're in arrears and here are the payment details. Now, most people know what their payment details are, but ultimately what we don't do is pick up the phone or send a WhatsApp message to say, hey, you okay? We've noticed you missed your payment. It's not like you. Is everything okay? You know, Sylvie will contact you on Tuesday at this time to have a chat. It's a far more human-centric approach, and what we've found of studies elsewhere is that approach through WhatsApp has a really high success rate, and we want to think about different channels in terms of how we contact people. It's also not about just dealing with the presenting problem. It's about taking a holistic conversation approach to individuals, you know, taking on the social work practice around strength-based approaches, undertaking well-being assessments, supporting people with a menu of choices. So even within a crisis or even through an earlier interaction, people still feel in control of the choices that are available to them and how they wish to access. And then building that around broader offers around employment and training, if that's what people are ready to do. But also recognising that often there are isolation factors sitting behind this as well. So it's not just about offering a service, but it's about understanding the locality and really understanding the assets within the locality so that we connect people with regards to things to do and places to go as part of that offer. And then obviously making sure that you know, that connection through communities continues and there's a feedback loop as part of the offer. So very different approach to Homes and Money to the one that we've got now. If I describe that briefly, we've got staff still sat behind plastic screens waiting for people to fall into crisis and for them to come to us. This is the alternative that we're putting in place. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll move on to the next one. Thank you. So one of the things that we kind of realised very quickly when we started looking at things like community hubs and libraries to determine, you know, where can we deliver some of these early intervention and prevention interventions from, was that you couldn't just look at a building in isolation. You needed to look at the whole locality and you needed to take a place shaping approach to that and really thinking about, you know, the role of communities within that so that it's community centred as part of that methodology. So we can talk about consolidating assets, but it's very much about how you have those conversations around how we build the alternative vision with communities. So it's designed by communities based on their needs and aspirations, but also based on the data piece in terms of what the requirements are within that area. So it's very traditional to other traditional estate regeneration approaches. So we went very quickly from an early intervention and prevention programme to recognising that actually there's a broader piece for the entire City Council around how we consolidate our assets, but really look at it through the lens of early intervention and prevention. So what you then start to do is, as part of that place shaping, is once you identify the assets that are essentially surplus to requirements as part of a place-based approach, you can then have the conversation about, okay, so how do we use those assets and repurpose those so that they actually meet the needs of a particular area, whether that's around you know, needing to knock some things down and replace that with social housing, or it's about thinking around, you know, do we need some sort of an economy hub in a particular area as part of that, and you know, what's the wider public estate in terms of police, NHS, etc., and how do we build that as a community vision for localities. Now, Birmingham is complicated by the fact that we've got over 65 wards, got 69 wards, so our definitions of locality can be very different to some other local authority areas. We've also got 10 parliamentary constituencies which overlay that. And then if you think about it from a community of interest point of view, the dynamics change even more so, and then you start to overlay that with the ICS structures. You can get very lost in that, is the point that I'm trying to make. Whereas if you remain citizen focused and think about, well, okay, what are the assets and resources that are needed for citizens and residents, it starts to open up a very, very different dialogue. Next slide, please. And again, this is just kind of reiterating the same point. In terms of if we take a place-based approach, we do deliver far better outcomes for citizens, especially when citizens fall into crisis. So rather than having a rather confusing landscape and about 10-15 doors to knock on, if you take a place-based approach and think about things like community hubs, it's one access point. It's much earlier interactions as part of that offer. It also means that we can utilise our assets to best effect. So in parts of our city, we've got assets which are, sitting half empty, underutilised, etc. And trying to resource those is nigh on impossible with regards to the numbers of staff that we might have in a locality. Whereas you can really start to shift things. So rather than have libraries that are only open part of the week, all of a sudden you've got the resources to be able to open them 6-7 days a week. As part of that. And then obviously sitting underneath this is also the elements of the savings that a local authority could generate as part of taking a very much a different approach to early intervention and prevention, but linking that to a place-based approach. In that space, it's recognising that you retain the narrative around citizen voice and the needs and aspirations of communities, and what's crucial here is that you're able to find the balance between the two. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm just going to use Shard End Library as to try and illustrate how this is coming to life on the ground. So this again is a very underutilised space. So we've got the library on the ground floor and we've got lots of unoccupied space on the second floor. And when we started to look at the area, we recognised that there was lots of potential for co-location of council services, particularly around careers advice, adult health and youth services, but at the same time being able to make a part-time drop-in offer as well, particularly around a health offer. So we've been talking to our local GP surgeries in that area, a focus around digital inclusion, homes and money advice, an obvious one, and working with the police around community safety. And then again, making sure that we can signpost people out from the library into the range of assets within that locality, and how we align this to the family hub funding that we've received, we're in the process of receiving for Birmingham City Council. And then again, leaning across to the early help offer within children's services as well. So as you can see, you can have an asset within a community, think whole life course as opposed to fragmented activity, something that's very, very easy to access, but also having that outreach ability to as well as part of the offer. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Shard End Library is in a very deprived part of the city. It's got 11% unemployment rates, got 15% of young people on universal credit, high levels of physical inactivity, high levels of deaths from strokes, issues around social isolation, particularly around carers and older people, and also high prevalence of domestic abuse in the area. So social, economic and health factors. But similarly, at the same time, if you take an asset-based approach and a strength-based approach and you look at the offer within that area, there are 60 assets already mapped and more being mapped as we speak. So I talked at the beginning about culture and approach and the way that it's as much as about how we do things as opposed to what we do things. We've, as an organisation, we've got to get far more savvy about how we make connections for individuals into those assets. And I'm deliberately using the word connections and not referrals. We have a culture of referrals to the community and Volog, and the only thing we do through that is generate demand somewhere else. And it causes pressures on community and Vologs. Whereas if you take a strength-based approach and you genuinely work with those assets within those communities, within those localities, thinking about place-based, then all of a sudden the offer to citizens and how we maximise the potential of all of those assets, all of those resources, be they service offers or be they things to do and places to go, suddenly becomes far more attractive and far more interesting as part of that offer. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are the lessons we've learned so far? So next slide, please. So three key areas. One is, as a result of the post-COVID crisis and now cost of living, it's really apparent that there's a growing normalisation of crisis. There's such a subtlety in terms of people not actually realising when they're in crisis, and this clearly puts greater pressure on our citizens and households and obviously the agencies that are then having to respond to that. For some cohorts of population, there's still a reluctance to ask for help, and there's a whole host of reasons for that, and part of it is down to fear and judgment and distrust. But the other part is the third point, which is very much around our system is quite complex, and some of our citizens have attempted to access services and basically been spat out the other end, and they keep trying, and then you end up in a crisis before somebody actually talks to you. So all of that past experience leads to that fear of judgment, distrust, and actually I don't think I'm going to get the help and support that I need. That's a narrative that's coming through time and time and again in terms of some of the case studies that we've looked at. And then ultimately, the system is complex. We talk a lot about systems change, don't we? We've done it for quite some time now. But, ultimately, such complex systems leaving citizens with no choice other than to come into physical locations to solve problems. Whereas actually we know in terms of that sort of self-navigation support or being supported by somebody to navigate, you get to people much earlier. You get to deal with issues before they escalate. Next slide, please. So in terms of our next steps, we are rapidly moving towards a cabinet report in February, March, which will set out our detailed target operating model and full business case. As with local authority structures, we've got a whole host of engagement that's taking place before then. Engagement with our partners and citizens I've already talked about, but also internally in terms of our management teams, our trade union representations, and also our elected members as well as ongoing engagement with our cabinet members. Okay, I think that's me done, Kevin. So thank you everybody for listening.